Good evening, hello, and welcome to the German Spy Museum, dem Deutschen Spionagemuseum, Berlin. My name is Sonja Longolius, and I'm the co-director of the Literaturhaus Berlin that is currently on tour through the whole city, while our beautiful villa in Charlottenburg is being renovated. And that's the reason why we are here tonight at the Spionagemuseum. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to today's German premiere of Rachel Kushner's latest novel, Creation Lake, that was published last year in the United States and was immediately shortlisted for the Booker Prize 2024. And finally, her thrilling novel was translated into German by Bettina Abar-Banel, which you see here, and we have at the book table later on the German version, but also the English version, of course. In See der Schöpfung, also German readers can now enjoy the spy mission of Kushner's protagonist, the former CIA agent Sadie Smith. It is a great honor and a great pleasure to have Rachel Kushner on our Liebe stage today, or tonight. So welcome to Berlin, the capital of spies, Rachel Kushner. And it is equally exciting to match the acclaimed US-American author in a book talk with Carla Reemtsma, one of the most famous voices of Fridays for Future in Germany. And yes, welcome. Thank you. And I'm also very happy to introduce to you the actor Marc Oliver Schulze, who will later read from the German translation of Creation Lake. So welcome to all of you. And without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphones, symbolically, to our wonderful guests. And I wish you all a thrilling evening and enjoy this evening tonight. Thank you very much for being here. Please.
I actually feel like I'm under interrogation right now because there's a spotlight just blasting me in the eyes. Is there anything that can be done about it?
I will not be too hard on you.
Oh, that's so much better. Thank you.
So do you directly want to start with one of the passages so we have a smooth start into the book and the conversation?
Yeah, sure. But maybe I did want to say something quickly about the location, only because I don't actually think of my novel as a spy novel. It has been talked about that way, so you know it's understandable to make the link. But the narrator of the novel is a disgraced former FBI agent. So she's an undercover detective who was fired from her job and then disappears into the private sector. And I think of police and spies as slightly different. She is an agent provocateur who introduces the possibility of political violence in order to manipulate other people and ruin their lives. So it's like slightly different and not necessarily glamorous or honorable work in any way. Anyway, so I'll just read the opening. Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. Although it was likely, he said, that these noble and mysterious talls, as he sometimes referred to the Neanderthals, extracted nicotine from the tobacco plant by a cruder method, such as by chewing its leaves, before that critical point of inflection in the history of the world, when the first man touched the first tobacco leaf to the first fire. Reading this part of Bruno's email, scanning from man to touch to leaf to fire, I pictured a 1950s greaser in a white t-shirt and a black leather jacket as he touches a lit match to the tip of his Camel cigarette and inhales. The greaser leans against a wall because that is what greasers do. They lean and loiter, and then he exhales. Bruno Lacombe told Pascal in these emails I was secretly reading that the Neanderthals had very large brains. Or at least their skulls were very large, and we can safely infer that their skulls were likely filled, Bruno said, with brains. He talked about the impressive size of Attal's brain case using modern metaphors, comparing them to motorcycle engines, which were also measured, he noted, for their displacement. Of all the human-like species who stood up on 2 feet, who roamed the earth for the last 1 million years, Bruno said that the Neanderthal's brain case was way out in front, at a whopping 1,800 cubic centimeters. I pictured a king of the road, way out in front. I saw his leather vest, his big gut, legs extended, engineer's boots resting on chromed forward-mounted foot pegs. His chopper is outfitted with ape hangers that he can barely reach, and which he pretends are not making his arms tired, are not causing terrible shooting pains to his lumbar region. We know from their skulls, Bruno said, that Neanderthals had enormous faces. I pictured Joan Crawford, that scale of face, dramatic, brutal, compelling. And thereafter, in the Natural History Museum in my mind, the one I was creating as I read Bruno's emails, its dioramas populated by figures in loincloths, all these ancient people Bruno described, the men too, they all had Joan Crawford's face. They had her fair skin and her flaming red hair. A propensity for red hair, Bruno said, had been identified as a genetic trait of the tall, as scientific advancements in gene mapping were made. And beyond such work, such proof, Bruno said, we might employ our natural intuition to suppose that, like typical redheads, the Neanderthals' emotions were strong and acute, spanning the heights and depths. A few more things, Bruno wrote to Pascal, that we now know about Neanderthals. They were good at math. They did not enjoy crowds. They had strong stomachs and were not especially prone to ulcers, but their diet of constant barbecue did its damage as it would to any gut. They were extra vulnerable to tooth decay and gum disease, and they had overdeveloped jaws, wonderfully capable of chewing gristle and cartilage, but inefficient for softer fare, a jaw that was overkill. Bruno described the jaw of the Neanderthal as a feature of pathos for its overdevelopment, the burden of a square jaw. Still, the tall's heavy bones and sturdy heat-conserving build were to be admired, Bruno said, especially compared to the breadstick limbs of modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. Bruno did not say breadstick, but since I was translating as he was writing these emails in French, I drew from the full breadth of English a wildly superior language and my native tongue. The Talls survived cold very well, he said, if not the eons, or so the story about them goes, a story that we must complicate, he said, if we are to know the truth about the ancient past, if we are to glimpse the truth about this world now, and how to live in it, how to occupy the present, and where to go tomorrow. My own tomorrow was thoroughly planned out. I would be meeting Pascal Balmy, leader of Le Moulin, to whom these emails from Bruno Lacombe were written, and I didn't need the Neanderthal's help on where to go. Pascal said to go to the Café de la Route on the main square in the village of Vantôme, and that was where I would be. Thanks.
So by reading that passage, you not just introduced Sadie, who is the main character and the spy or the agent provocateur, as you already mentioned in the beginning, but also Bruno and Pascal, who are two of the main characters as well, and the correspondence that Sadie is reading, even though she's not supposed to, she is reading the emails exchanged between Pascal and Bruno introduces all these concepts of French political ecology and anarchist ideology from the 1968 movement. And I was really interested because there's this big gap between talking about modern ecological destruction, and at the same time having all these references back to political ideas from the 1960s and 70s. And I was really interested. One was the first moment you got in touch with that French political theory, which, spans a thread throughout the whole book and comes up again and again.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, Bruno's ideas and theories are largely invented by his creator, who is me. And he's a Frenchman in his 80s who has lived through, history with a capital H, and lost his entire family in World War II, and ended up on the streets of Paris as an orphan, and encountered there Guy Debord, because that's what you get to do with fiction. And I had read a memoir by an associate of Debord a long time ago. It's a book I've reread several times, by Jean-Michel Moncion, who was, like Bruno, somebody who lost his family in the war and ended up like a delinquent who lived on the streets, who was very good at thieving. And he and his friends would steal bottles from the wine cellar of the Brasserie Lip, and they met Debord, who was very educated and from a bourgeois family, and had an apartment and a car, and was intellectual, but admired this knowledge that the kids had, which was the knowledge of the delinquent, somebody who doesn't have to care about the structures of the bourgeois world any longer because there's nothing for them to lose. And there's the way that Moncion describes this in the book always seemed so mysterious to me, and the way that all these people drank so heavily. Debord was very influenced by the Surrealists, and they were the ones that sort of declared that their territory was this bar, the Mabillon and Moineau's, and these debates would take place there drunkenly. And then Debord and his associates, who were in this group called the Lettres International, drank at those bars. And there's a way in which leaving society and breaking the bonds with conformity and the logic of the marketplace could happen through drinking alone, and so I don't know, that book always interested me, and so I gave some of his backstory to Bruno. But then Bruno is somebody who's very formed, like Debord was, and like all French leftists of that generation were very shaped by May of 1968, and what happened in France with this kind of legendary, this is not really in the book, but since you ask, the way that the students and the factory workers came together, and it looked like finally there was going to be the destruction of the former political system in France, and something new would come into place, and the old Communist Party was no longer relevant, and there was going to be this kind of wild new insurgent socialism, and that failed. And I think that it was really devastating for people that it did fail. And Bruno, like the people that he's sort of inspired by, decided that the factory worker in the city is not the revolutionary subject. That person just wants to go to the movies on the weekend and engage in the consumer economy. And so there was this movement to nature, going back into these small villages and trying to tap into this strong kind of spirit of resistance that you find in the French peasantry. And many people engaged in these social projects in the 1970s in France. Like there was this famous occupation of the Larzac plateau to stop Mitterrand from expanding an army base. And it was like an incredible consortium of different kinds of people, including like clergy from the Catholic Church and sheep herders and hippies and people who'd been very involved in May of '68. And I think that there's a real precedence there, and this kind of romantic idea of going back to the land and engaging in farming. And farming is really difficult work. I have a cousin who's a farmer. He makes me work on his farm, and it's not easy. Everything is done by hand the way he does it. But I think a lot of people in the 70s discovered this as well and kind of gave up on it, not just because the work was physically difficult, but the politics and the social values of people in rural France were not necessarily going to be the same as the values of people coming from the city to live among farmers, and sort of as Mao would say, like, step off of your horse and smell the flowers. This idea that you're supposed to spend time in the country with the real people, you know. So some of these projects failed. Bruno, among them, he's left Paris and ends up outside the village of Vendôme, which is fictionalized, but it's meant to be somewhere in central southwestern France, somewhere between the department Lot and the Corrèze and the Dordogne and maybe the western Lozère. And he goes through this process where he becomes disillusioned by the idea of the peasant being the true revolutionary, and he ends up living in a cavern on his own property and looking toward the very ancient past. He's decided by the time the book takes place, which is roughly 2013, that no revolution is happening. Capitalism is here to stay. It is so sort of supple and slippery that it will always outsmart us, and capitalism in crisis is just another market opportunity for capitalism. And yet he has not given up hope and has come to believe in this idea of revolutionizing consciousness itself and leaving this world while remaining in it. And that is kind of very vaguely inspired by this philosopher named Jacques Camotte. I didn't know that much about Camotte, but I knew people who seemed to be in long conversation with him. I knew that he supposedly lived he just died, by the way, last month, I think the day before the Pope died, or the day after, right circa same time. He lived in a cave, people said, but he also seemed to be in long email communication with people I knew. And I just took that as this glint, and I felt like I understood a person like Bruno and could take just the vaguest outline of Camotte and think about a person who doesn't think of himself as a primitivist, but is looking to the very deep past for clues on how we should proceed. So he's like sort of inspired by a French philosopher, but he's also kind of, you know, he's made by me, but he's made from materials that come from my own exposure. So it's an insightful question. Like, I have spent a fair amount of time among French thinkers of that generation who would probably disagree very strongly with Bruno, you know, because there are internecine splits among these people. But there is a way of speaking and teaching at the same time that Bruno engages in the book that is very familiar to me as the one who's mostly listening. And that's partly through my husband, who was a student of Jacques Derrida and has rejected kind of deconstruction to a degree, and then translates some other philosophers, Alain Badiou, who wouldn't agree with Bruno at all. But that has given me access to this world through him, I guess, originally.
Yeah, wow. So now you talked about the access to the philosophical world and the ideas of Bruno.
They turned up that light while I was talking.
Maybe they can turn it down again.
They were sending me messages.
So if we're talking about access to a world I would be really interested in. So the novel, the plot is set in France. It's set in rural France, as you said. We're in the village of Guyenne, which is in southern France, a very rural area. We're talking about agriculture, about small-scale farming in conflict with industrial agriculture. And this is, whilst we probably all know that there is this huge ecological crisis which is unfolding and which is man-made and happening all around us, I think there's very little talk about this right now. And so I was being a climate activist myself, so interested in that there's actually a novel set in this very, very concrete environment where at the same time we have the environment which is so nurturing to the community on the one hand side, and at the same time it's destructed by the corporations who are building up those mega bassins, so these really, really big tanks full of water. The big agricultural companies are filling with all of the water, making it really hard, destroying the environment on the one hand side and making small-scale farming really, really hard because those farmers don't have access to water anymore. And there's a lot to talk about the climate protests happening in France, but I will stop myself here. But would be really interested in how did you access this world and set the plot in there? Because I think that's not the most usual area where a plot for a spy novel, if you said you don't want to be called a spy novel, usually takes place, and how you engage with this environment.
Sure, yeah. I mean, in terms of the genre, it's like, I never want to mislead anyone into thinking that it's a genre novel, because it's its own genre. I guess it's literary fiction, but I borrowed certain elements in having this narrator. Yeah, I mean, in another context, I would love to ask you about your relationship to climate activists in France. One thing I think that the novel is good at is kind of letting contradictions out to play, because when you're involved in something like activism, usually, at least my understanding is that there's a need for moral clarity. There's one way that would be a good way to move toward the future, and another way that you want to stand up and say, this is wrong, and we need to reject this, and this is an emergency. And in fiction, you can kind of dig into the moral contradictions and the fact that it's very painful, I think, for people to acknowledge sometimes that things are more complicated than they would like them to be. So, for instance, the area where I set the book, it's fictionalized. I call the region the Guyenne, which is a name that was used for a lower part of Aquitaine, France, up until the French Revolution. So it's a defunct name. It's kind of a wink to basically where it is. And it's based on a real place that I know very well. I go there every summer, and it's an area that's had a lot of out-migration. It's very difficult there for farmers to make a living, and young people don't want to take over their parents, their family's farm. They want to move to a city and probably will get a job at Leader Price or Mr. Bricolage or whatever. They end up working in the service industry. This is also an area where you do have a sense of the incredible agricultural history of France. I mean, when you ride the TGV, you see industrial agriculture. There's just like fields for miles, and they're growing one thing. And we take it for granted sometimes. It's just color out the window. And this is the monocrop economies, right, that allow farmers to be competitive in the EU. And you can correct me, because I'm not an expert on this stuff, but this area where I spend time, the farmers are still farming in the way that they were farming 100 years ago, and even 200 or 300 years ago. And you can feel that there's this history of a time, like as I understand it, up through World War II, a third of French people made their primary living as farmers. Now it's less than 2%. And it's very difficult to be a farmer because, the prices set by France or set by the EU for dairy farmers, for instance, it's sometimes more expensive to produce milk than it is to sell your milk. And the farm, and this is where some of the contradictions come in. And there's a sort of scene that's meant to be comic in the book, but also maybe on another level not so funny, which is the activists come to this town and they engage in subsistence farming, and they go to the council meetings of the dairy farmers, and they want to help them and support them in their cause to stop the state from monopolizing water and taking all the water out of the water table and putting it into these things called mega basins. And so that's this project that the commune is trying to help with, and that the narrator, Sadie, is trying to get them raided by the police and get them shut down in the interest of agribusiness. But the activists go to the Dairy Council meeting and they come back and say, you know, we felt uncomfortable there. The dairy farmers are, you know, they use rough language. They have bigoted ideas. They're racist. They're really mad at the EU because they don't want new environmental controls. You know, they just want to dump their pesticides in the streams. And they're sort of shocked by it in this very refined Parisian way. If you go to the Grande École, you won't necessarily know how to talk to people who are going to very easily blame the other for the problems that they're having. And they're surprised by the idea that the farmers mostly just want cheap gasoline, you know, and to be free to farm in the way they want. And so there's this kind of conversation that goes on where Pascal, the leader, says, like, who are you to tell them how to farm? And I kind of agree with him in a way, but that's what you get to do as a novelist, is sort of point out that the interests of the climate and the interests of the farmers and the interests of the activists are not always going to align.
That's so interesting, because as this novel is placed in 2013, and at the same time it feels, and it's obviously informed by, I would assume it's informed by contemporary discussions, it feels so, very current, and it's all the debates we're having right now within the climate movement. So we're moving towards the space where we're seeing the ecological destruction unfold and fall down on humanity in forms of crisis everywhere, in forms of extreme weather events, but also like the ecological crisis, the existential threats which we see within the agricultural system. So all of this is unfolding while at the same time we are having all these harsh debates. We just had the farmers' protests in Germany, but also in France, in Brussels, happening all around. So were these happening something that informed your writing, or was it something where because at the same time it feels a bit as if the literature you're writing is making us imagine worlds which weren't thought to be possible at the same time, because you wrote the books about the protests before the big protests in France took place.
That's true, yeah. No, it wasn't really like current events informed. I mean, only in the sense that current events leak into, you know, the way you experience a place, but it's more like I know farmers in the region, and I can see, you know, like my son started going to this camp when he was 7 in a very remote part of the department Lot. And the guy who runs the camp knows the whole underground structure of this region and takes kids into caves, and they go like 2 kilometers underground. And my son ended up working at that camp. And my former French agent, is this being live streamed? Okay. Someone I knew sent their kids to that camp and stopped sending them there. And I said, you know, why did you stop sending your kids? And she said, well, you know, the Jean-Paul is like, he's not politically correct. He says things that are very upsetting. And there's this sense that there is a social divide that I've witnessed up close in terms of, you know, city and country. And these things matter because those people need help and spokespeople who are educated, who come from the cities, but there are sometimes going to be misunderstandings between people, you know? So some of the like humor about the farmers is just me knowing these farmers and being around people whose first language actually isn't French, it's Occitan. And that's what they speak at home. And so this is like if you speak a different language, you also kind of live in a different reality. Because I go to the same place every summer, I can see there are summers where the river is so dry that the tourists are picking up their canoes and walking through parts of the river and then putting them back down again. And some of that I can just see for myself is because people have resorted to growing corn because they can make money by selling foie gras. And corn requires an enormous amount of water from the river. And the farmers who are closest to the river they have, access to water. I needed the militants who live there came from the city. They formed this commune. I needed them to sort of have something to face off against the French state over. And I'd just seen a reference to these mega basins, but in a completely different region of France, more in the northwest, in Normandy. And I just thought, oh, that's a good one, in part because Bruno lives underground. And like my son, who is not the inspiration for Bruno, he understands how the water table is stored in the earth. The earth is a really ingenious storage system for water. It keeps the water cool, it prevents it from evaporating, and it filters and cleans the water over and over again. So the idea of taking all the water out of the earth and putting it into giant plastic-lined bays the size of football fields, it's just incredibly stupid. So I thought, this will be the issue, and I borrowed it. And by the time I finished writing the book, this had erupted into a huge issue in France, and you could just go on YouTube and see these pitched, violent battles between farmers and activists on one side and police on the other. More, in the Northwest, not in that region, but it was kind of like I was, you writing the novel, it's like going down a slide, and I entered the pool, and the pool was reality. And it included this whole new movement called Le Soulèvement de la Terre, which is very organized and interesting. But also, the novel features this scene at an agricultural fair with this kind of fraudulent deputy subminister of the Ministry of Rural Coherence. And I made that up. It doesn't exist. And he goes to the agricultural fair as a sort of public relations stunt to take a picture with the prize-winning Holstein heifer. And this melee erupts because the protesters are there, and the dairy farmers are dumping their milk, which is something that happens in France. I've seen that happen. And it's quite visually striking to see this lake of white of all the milk going to waste. So that's all going on, and it's total mayhem, and you have to read the book to find out what happens to the deputy sub-minister. He's kind of inspired by someone that was actually the prime minister of France. And he doesn't come to a good ending. And I didn't have it in me to knock off a prime minister. So I heavily demoted him to deputy sub-minister. But so I wrote this scene. And then after I finished writing the book, Macron tried to attend the big agricultural fair that takes place outside Paris, and the farmers blocked the road with this huge wall of hay bales and set the hay bales on fire. And it was kind of amazing because it was a sort of an echo of the book, but in real life.
Yeah, and that is what I found so interesting, because we talked a bit before this reading, obviously, and I thought it was much more inspired by the happenings, because I've been, as a climate activist, closely following what's been going on in France, and hearing that actually you kind of, used literature as a way to explore a reality which wasn't there yet at the time you wrote the book, but make possible that access also for other people, because I think most of the people don't know how a movement works, what people think who live in rural France, all of these happenings which are taking place, which are so ambiguous, with all these different interests in place, both from big capital corporations and at the same time small-scale farmers, activists who don't understand those farmers because it's just so different, making this come to life in a setting where we're experiencing all these conflicts right now in France, but in Germany as well, and in the States. I guess the situation is even more dire, but I think we're not going there. I have lots more questions, but maybe you want to read another passage before we move on. Sure. Or as we move on.
This is Sadie. I mean, she tells the reader that's her name. We don't know her real name. When she's on her way to infiltrate the activists. Oh, wait. I was on toll roads pulling over to drink regional wines in highway travel centers, franchised and generic, with food steaming under orange heat lamps, each of these travel centers offering local products. Lavender oils, for instance, always made at monasteries, as if the monks worshipped lavender instead of God. Or dried truffles, mustards, and glass jars of jellied meats that look like cat food and which French people call a terrine and eat as if it were not cat food. It all gets mixed up in your stomach anyhow, I heard no one say as people lined up to buy this stuff. I sampled these wines from the vantage of plastic seating overlooking fuel pump and highway. I sipped rosé from the Luberon at a clammily air-conditioned monop off the A55, a chaotic place where children screeched and a haggard woman dragged a dirty mop over the floor. The rosé was delicate and fruity, crisp as ironed linen. I found a Pecharmant from the oldest vintner in Bergerac at the L'Arche cafeteria on the autoroute A7, a wine that was woody with notes of ambergris and laurel and maybe dried apricot. I enjoyed a white Bordeaux of Médoc provenance on plein air at a roadside fuel stop where a trucker farted loudly while paying for his diesel at the automatic pump, the loose valves of his truck, like his own loose valves, clattering away. This white Bordeaux was smooth as a silk garment in a virgin's trousseau. I could have been a little buzzed by this point, 5 hours into my drive. This cold, dry white wine sent me dreaming about a world where all my clothes were white and I slept on white sheets and would never be traded for a dowry or violated by rough and unworthy men or forced to drink anything less than the finest French wines of the smallest and oldest and most esteemed appellations. And in a way I could say that I was living that life, right here at this gas station. At least in spirit I was. I care about fine wine, but not about food, and because the terrine is efficient, comes in its own container, and can be consumed unheated, I stole 2 jars of it from one of these travel centers, the weight of the jars giving a new tug to the leather straps of my handbag as I purchased my wine. It wasn't that I believed the wine I bought was payment enough for my jars of human cat food. Stealing is a way to stop time. Also, it refocuses the mind, the senses, if they become dulled, for instance, by drinking. Stealing puts reality into sharper relief. You're in a highway travel center, people in a great flux and flow, coming and going and milling and choosing, the cashiers in a fugue state of next and next and next. And in order to locate the precise moment when you can take unseen, you slow it all down. You make time stop. You insert into reality what composers call a fermata, and while time is stopped, you put something in your bag. In this way, I test my fitness. I test my ability to see. I gauge what other people see, and also what they fail to see.
So now you've all also gotten to know Sadie a little bit. Sadie is the narrator of the book as well. She's not an unreliable narrator, but she is also not telling everything. And she's such a interesting character as she's very ambiguous. On the one hand side, we know that it's morally completely wrong what she's doing, going in that anarchist commune in France and basically pushing the people to do more violence than they planned on doing, or we don't really know. And she exposes some of her past, why she got fired from the FBI because she actually made people do very violent things. And at the same time, she is so approachable and she is so likable. And we hear her writing things and it just feels like, oh yeah, she could be a friend of you and me. And I think that is so interesting because she is such an ambiguous character, and also a lot of the other characters are very very ambiguous. You talked about the relationship of the activists to the farmers, how they oftentimes can't really understand one another, that the language is so different. Unlike Sadie, they can't blend in that area, but try to find a common understanding. And I would say it's hard to classify if the things they're doing, the decisions they're making are right or wrong most of the time. And I would be interested to hear how you see this kind of ambiguity in the book. Do you think it's part of your storytelling in a more honest way to actually tell the story rather than present something which seems very easy and where you say this is right and this is wrong?
Well, like I was saying before, I think that maybe that's like one of the striking differences between art and activism is that activism requires moral clarity, and art is a space for a different, less useful form of the truth. In terms of her, she was kind of inspired by a few different people, but this phenomenon of undercover cops infiltrating leftist activists. And, that's a strange world to me. Like, there was a young guy in California who was entrapped by this FBI agent, and he was in love with her, and he was a friend of a friend, and she was getting mighty pressure from her superiors to produce evidence that these people were quote unquote violent. Just want to say I personally don't consider the destruction of private property to be violence. That's just my own semantics, like hurting people is violent. But so she's getting pressure to produce evidence that these people are plotting violence, and this guy is a real person. His name's Eric McDavid. She sort of convinced him that they were going to be together, but that to prove to her that he was her soulmate, he needed to show her how serious he was about the movement. And she got him to buy ingredients to build a bomb, and no one was hurt, and he went to prison. He was charged with 21 years in federal prison and served 9 of those years. And then his lawyer was able to establish that this woman had entrapped him. So she was fired from the FBI. And I had wondered, what is the mentality of the kind of person who engages with that? And then there was this undercover agent in England, Mark Kennedy, who was infiltrating leftist activists, climate groups among them, in Germany, France, and England, and having affairs with all these different women in the groups. And apparently he was wearing a wire, and his superior and his superior's superior knew about the whole thing and are listening in on everything. And when he was caught, it was a huge problem for the British police, because these women all sued the Metropolitan UK Authority for the fact that this guy was using state funds to have affairs with them and misrepresent himself. And then it turned out there was another spy named Bob Lambert who was infiltrating a woman, married her, and had a child with her. The child ended up suing the UK police for having a fictitious father, which is pretty heavy. So after Mark Kennedy was caught, he basically disappeared into the private sector, and he was hired by the military contractor Blackwater. And this kind of clued me in that there's life after disgrace from one of these police agencies. And so Sadie, in terms of her immorality or maybe her tone, whether it's likable or not, is sort of my answer to the question of what is the mentality. And so I see her mentality as being overconfident, fairly blunt. She says things that are sort of partly true, but could be countered by another truth that is the opposite, and yet, also like the part that we're going to hear read next about the real Europe is like that. And she limits herself to just having an affair with one person in the commune rather than 10.
So you already mentioned it, seeing a lot of backlash on political activism. We are having a pretty heated debate all over Europe and in the States, where there's repression coming up more and more. We have in Germany had like new laws coming up making it harder for people to be politically active. We see a lot of like smear campaigns throughout the media. The political violence is increasing, and at the same time we see how also the society becomes more polarized on all of these issues. So was that also this way of accessing a story, your way trying to contextualize political activism, and the way you said, oh, you just clarified it for yourself, destruction of property, you wouldn't say that it's violence, so finding a way to actually give context and a more open conversation around what are the motives, what is actually going on when we're having this debate at the same time politically and in society?
Honestly, I didn't really think about that much. I mean, the book is like, there's those long, like dreamy sequences of Bruno thinking about the Neanderthals and like wondering if, you know, there was another group of people who had a better idea about how to live, like more gentle, lived in smaller clans, you know, slept longer hours. You know, the activists ask him, like, why do you say the Neanderthals smoked? Like, we thought tobacco was a New World plant. And, you know, we're focused on rewilding what we believed was native to this part of Europe. And then he starts to lecture them about their received ideas about the history of humanity being a 3-act structure of, you know, up and out of Africa, and then into Europe, and then into the New World. And he says, you know, do you walk in only one direction? And, you know, people don't, obviously. And there is this way in which when you read, you know, anthropology, at least up until recently, there's this idea that people are moving in one direction, like they're trekking with a backpack, and they finally get to Europe and take off the pack, and they're like, phew, you know, but as he points out, it didn't happen like that. And, you know, some people went into Europe and then went back into Africa. And now they've actually discovered traces of the Neanderthals in North Africa. So he's saying to them, like, you know, yes, tobacco is an old world plant. I mean, he's being a bit mythical in his logic, but I was very much with him and in that voice, and thinking about this man as he felt very real to me, and his history and his deep personal history kind of opened like a flower for me. And he seemed like somebody who is convinced that there's something important and meaningful about the human project. And, you know, he describes reality like this. He says, currently we are heading toward extinction in a shiny driverless car. And the question is, how do we exit this car? So I was thinking about things that I think anyone could think about if they let themselves think about it, but are things that are painful to think about. So I could think about them through Bruno. I mean, the description of the speeding toward extinction in a shiny driverless car has become more literally true since I wrote the book than it was before. And the question of how to exit it is not an easy one to answer. So I don't know, you know, I don't really think about, like, I'm not like reading the news, but, you know, I've been around enough sort of anarchists who engage in communal spaces to know what some of the challenges are and to know kind of what it feels like.
Yeah, you've been talking a bit about Bruno. So Bruno oftentimes introduces the Neanderthal as, the different human race or species basically who was there, and explores, I think, or at least it challenged a lot of my beliefs around what I learned about the human, how humanity actually managed to be at the point where it is right now, and how the progress of civilization took place, but actually explores, as you just told it about tobacco, that things have been much different than we might assume back in the past already. And I think...
Well, I don't think tobacco is an old world plant. I should just make clear. He's a producer of myths.
Yeah. But I think that just is one of the ways it challenges our ideas of progress and civilization, and shows how there is this tendency within like processes of civilization that creation can also easily turn into destruction, which we then also see reflected in the commune and in the méga-bassins, in the agriculture, very, very close to the peoples. And I wanted to know do you think that Bruno also, you just said he was a way for you to explore these concepts, but also to help the readers explore all these different thoughts for which we might not have the room when we're talking about all the like everyday things which are happening around us and like big policy things in like Berlin, Paris, New York, Washington?
I'm not an activist, and so I don't think about policy. I just write novels. So yeah, it just doesn't come up. But I think, like I said, the question of how to proceed, given the technological destruction of the earth seems like a natural question, but it's not like he's a device for me. That's just what happens when you're writing a novel. You get into the trance of it, and the person feels real, and they have a voice, and then they take on a certain kind of depth. So I built his history as a series of kind of hopes and excitement, and then devastating disappointments and paranoia, and he loses his daughter, as Sadie knows from his dossier, by teaching her to drive a tractor when she was little. And I happen to know from working on farms that old tractors especially, are very dangerous. And he, after that, kind of takes this personal penance and moves from his house into his barn and lives with his animals. And then he moves from the barn to a dry stone hut that they're called bori. If anybody's done any like traveling through the Dordogne or the Lot, you see these little strange stone huts with an open doorway. And no one knows what they were originally used for. They're like 500 years old, and people think maybe they were for shepherds to keep tools in or to escape from a rainstorm or something. He lives in the dry stone hut, and from there he discovers this underground cavern on his property and starts living underground. And Sadie analyzes him psychologically and thinks that he's sort of punishing himself for the loss of his daughter, and that he rejects modern farming methods and embraces permaculture because the tractor, was the device that killed his daughter. He's rejected even the plow, which, like hurts microorganisms in the soil. I mean, there are people like that. But as my son told me, there are also vegans who put sponges on the bottom of their shoes so that they won't kill ants when they're walking. I don't know if he made that up or if it's true. But should we hear some of the book in German, do you think?
Yeah, I think that would be amazing.
Nach ein paar Drinks fahre ich besser, konzentrierter. Anstatt zu versuchen, irgendetwas auf dem Telefon zu lesen oder Lippenstift aufzutragen, schaute ich nach mehreren Gläsern dieser regionalen Weine strikt geradeaus und lenkte mit beiden Händen. Der Alkohol hatte mich so eingelullt, dass ich nur noch tat, was ich tun sollte: Autofahren. Allerdings entschied ich mich, da die Mautstraßen mich einzuschläfern drohten, für eine landschaftlich schönere Strecke und irrte durchs Zentralmassiv mit seinen vielen die Gänge schindenden Kurven. Klar ging ich beim Kuppeln nicht zimperlich vor, aber es fällt mir schwer zu glauben, dass Mietwagen etwas wert sind. Dieser, ein kleiner Fließheck-Skoda, kostete 8 € am Tag. Ich hatte eine Pauschalsumme als Reisebudget bekommen und mich deshalb fürs Sparen entschieden. Womit verdienten diese Autovermietungen eigentlich Geld? Sie hatten brandneue Fahrzeuge. Man musste kaum etwas für sie zahlen und niemand kontrollierte den Wagen, bevor man damit aus dem Parkhaus fuhr. Der Skoda war ein sauberer Diesel. Ein Oxymoron, das als Metapher für irgendetwas stand, ich wusste nur nicht wofür. Sauberer Diesel. Saubere Kohle. Man füge das Wort sauber hinzu und bäm, die Sache ist sauber. Mein Navi funktionierte nicht und die landschaftlich schönere Strecke führte mich landschaftlich viel zu schön über einen Gipfel. Ach komm, sagte ich laut, wenn links und rechts von mir nutzlose Ausblicke, roséfarbene römische Ruinen und auf zerklüfteten Felsen thronende Burgen auftauchten. Ich kam an einem Turm auf einer Klippe vorbei, dessen oberer Rand angefressen aussah wie eine Eiswaffel, wenn das Eis weg ist und das Kind vertraglich verpflichtet, vom geschmacklosen Behältnis abzubeißen. Zur Hölle damit, sagte ich. Die atemberaubenden Ausblicke waren unattraktiv, weil sie mir bestätigten, dass ich mich verfahren hatte. Inzwischen wünschte ich mir nur noch einen Hinweis darauf, dass ich in nordwestlicher Richtung unterwegs war, zum Städtchen Boulières, das Lucien mir als Ansammlung krummer, schmutziger Straßen beschrieben hatte, bewohnt von hässlichen Menschen mit schäbigen Autos, aber gut geeignet, um mich im Carrefour oder Leader Price einzudecken, bevor ich zum Duboischen Familienanwesen fuhr. Ich befand mich mitten in einsamem, bewaldetem Hochland. Nirgends ein Schild nach Boulières. Auf einem Gipfel fuhr ich an den Straßenrand und parkte auf einem ungepflasterten Platz bei einer Art Berggaststätte, in der Hoffnung, dort könne mir jemand den Weg beschreiben. Die Gaststätte hatte zu. Es wirkte, als sei sie schon seit einer Weile nicht mehr geöffnet gewesen. Die Außenmauern waren mit Graffiti besprüht. Verzerrte Namen und Symbole, die keinerlei Können verrieten, nichts Schönes schufen. Diese Art Graffiti, die in Europa häufig genug zu sehen ist, scheint vor allem entstellend. Manche Verbrechen, selbst schwere, sind durchaus natürliche Vorgänge. Sogar Mord ist nachvollziehbar, wenn man mal darüber nachdenkt. Es ist menschlich, seinen Feind auslöschen zu wollen oder der Welt zu demonstrieren, so wütend bin ich gerade, selbst wenn man später bereut, jemanden umgebracht zu haben. Aber ein unleserliches, schludriges Symbol auf ein Gebäude sprühen, warum? Es hatte hier oben gerade geregnet. Die Luft war feucht, warm und stickig wie menschlicher Atem. Der Parkplatz war mit gemusterten Spuren von Lkw-Reifen schraffiert. Der Regen hatte gewaltige Pfützen hinterlassen, milchschokoladenbraun die Oberfläche, ein Himmelsiebdruck. Keine Lkws, nur ihre Spuren. In den Ästen der niedrigen Bäume jenseits des Parkplatzes hing Nebel, als wäre eine Wolke auf diesen Berg heruntergekommen und hätte ihre ausgefransten Teile zwischen den Bäumen gelassen. Das Ganze wirkte auf mich wie ein Ort, an dem irgendetwas Schlimmes passiert war. Ich ging im waldigen Bereich hinter dem Parkplatz pinkeln. Während ich da hockte, fiel mein Blick auf eine neon-orangefarbene Frauenunterhose, die sich auf Augenhöhe im Gebüsch verfangen hatte. Das fand ich nicht weiter seltsam. Lkw-Spuren und ein im Gebüsch hängen gebliebener Slip, das ist Europa. Das wahre Europa ist kein schickes Café an der Rue de Rivoli mit vergoldeten Fresken, kleinen Tässchen der berühmten Chocolat chaud, hellrosafarbenen und mintgrünen Babymacarons und nach zu viel Shopping völlig überdrehten Kindern, die sich auf ihre Kekse freuen, rituelle Belohnung eines Samstagsausflugs mit Maman. Das ist eine Vorstellung von Europa, wie gewisse Pariser sie hegen, und sie ist genauso unwirklich wie die idyllischen Szenen der Fresken in den schicken Cafés. Das wahre Europa ist ein grenzenloses Liefer- und Transportnetzwerk. Das wahre Europa sind eingeschweißte Paletten mit ultrahochheizter Milch, Nesquik-Pulver oder Halbleitern, Autobahnen und Kernkraftwerke, fensterlose Verteilungslager, vor denen unsichtbare Männer Polen, Moldawier, Mazedonier mit ihren leeren LKWs zurücksetzen und Waren einladen, um sie durch ein gigantisches Netzwerk namens Europa zu befördern, von dem ein Texas großes Stück Frankreich heißt. Diese Männer werden Gewichtsvorschriften ihrer Ladungen ebenso ignorieren wie Sicherheitsüberprüfungen ihrer Bremsen. Sie werden jemandem zu Hause in ihrer jeweiligen Nationalsprache texten, englischsprachige Popmusik hören und ihre Bedürfnisse vor Ort befriedigen, an leeren Parkplätzen auf Gebirgspässen. Das einzige Rätsel ist, wo sie die Frauen für diese Gelegenheiten finden, aber selbst das ist nicht allzu schwer vorstellbar. Eine Frau in schwieriger Lage, keine Französin, ohne EU-Dokumente, die in irgendeiner abgelegenen Siedlung festsitzt und sich mit unpraktischen, hochhackigen Schuhen aus ins Fleisch schneidendem Lederimitat auf die Hauptstraße wagt, in der Handtasche Aloe Vera, um irgendwem schnellfeuerartig einen runterzuholen. Sie hatte ihren Slip in diesem Wald gelassen. Und wenn schon, ihre Welt ist voller Wegwerfdinge. Die Unterhose, die in einem Gebüsch vor meiner Nase hängt, stammt aus einem Paket mit 3 Stück für 5 € bei Carrefour. Sie sind wie Kleenex. Man schwitzt, tropft oder blutet in sie hinein und wirft sie dann ins Gebüsch oder in den Müll oder spült sie im Klo runter und verstopft die Rohrleitung, idealerweise die von jemand anderem. Ich hatte getrunken, wie gesagt. Und ich musste weiter. Ich machte Bier, wie ein unrasierter moldawischer Lkw-Fahrer es vielleicht ausdrücken würde. Ein schäumender Stausee entstand unter mir, überschwemmte dann seine provisorischen Dämme und strömte weiter wie Voraustruppen, die zu einer Aufklärungsmission den Berg hinunter geschickt werden. Ich pinkelte immer noch und beobachtete, wie mein Urin bergab floss, als ich Schritte hörte. Ich erschrak. War hier jemand?
We didn't explain that he's continuing Sadie, so, but maybe that was obvious to the audience. So, you know, it's different if it's told by a woman because she's squatting to pee, right? But we just assume that, you know. It's now illegal in my country for women to read the parts of men and for men to read the parts of women. I just made that up. Trump will send you to El Salvador if you do that there.
So that was, I found that passage so interesting when I read it because it's such a brutally honest description of the European economic system, the supply chains, and the implications that has for Europe and people living all over Europe. And at the same time, this is in such a stark contrast to what is happening in the commune with Pascal, with Bruno, who are really taking this very different approach and looking at how does ecological belonging look like, how do humans interact with their environment. Do you want to confront people with those kind of thoughts to, broaden like the thinking and because it's like these are worlds apart between what we've just read and like the explorations of Bruno and his philosophy?
Well, it's not like I want to do anything in particular. I mean, when you're writing fiction, it seems like it's the conditions of possibility for having an encounter with your own unconscious. So things come up that you didn't know were going to happen. And that's part of why it's so challenging and difficult. You can't just muscle out a novel the way that I could, for instance, write an essay. And I do write essays. Fiction is much more fickle. You cannot force it. And once it starts to happen, then you have a person, you know, a fictionalized character who becomes a kind of instrument through which things emerge that you didn't anticipate. I experience both of these contradictory textures. Like the EU builds these massive autoroutes, right? That's who builds those routes in France, and they're very, very efficient. And France is a huge country. It actually is the size of Texas, believe it or not. I think that's funny because it's like I'm saying it's huge, but it's only like one of our 50 states. These routes can take you from Marseille to Toulouse, and you can span hundreds of kilometers quickly. And that experience would maybe give you the impression that this is Europe, and then those men on the side of the highway doing work that have the reflective band around the bottom cuff of their state issue pants. Sadie says that's also the real Europe. And my son goes, well, France is powered mostly by nuclear power, and sometimes we pass nuclear power plants and evidence of them. And so she's being cynical and manipulative to say this is the real Europe. Obviously, the village and this technology for making roofs out of what are called lows, which are just rocks that are piled to make the roof. That Europe is real also. There's a part of the Corrèze where all the roofs are made out of slate. And I've been to the slatery where people, it's all men, are hand chiseling from this quarry these pieces of slate to make these roofs. So that ancient France, and also, frankly, the France of the Neanderthals. I walk paths next to the Vézère River that have been continuously used probably for 500,000 years by people. And they found Neanderthal jewelry next to the Vézère River. And you can feel all of that. It has nothing to do with the nuclear power plants, but both of them are descriptions of Europe. So Sadie's declaration that the real Europe is the nuclear power plants is her thinking she's a little smarter than she really is. And someone put that passage on Twitter, and people thought it was me making this declaration, and it went viral, and there was like a lot of outrage. Like, that's not the real Europe. You know, let me tell you about the real Europe. And it worried me because I thought people have lost the ability to read fiction and to understand that she's just one part of things. And then I did an event in Edinburgh, Scotland, when my book came out in September. And I was interviewed there by a farmer and best-selling author named James Rebanks. I don't know if he's published in German. He makes his living as a shepherd, and he's written these beautiful books about rewilding his own land. And he said, "Can you read that part about the real Europe? You know, that's so great." And I said, well, it's made people so upset. And he said, the thing is, and this surprised me, because I thought for the farmer, the Europe is a different Europe. And for him, the incursions of the state and this kind of massive infrastructure and the way that it affects your land and the runoff and all of that, like, was a part of his reality. So I thought that was interesting that a farmer wanted me to read that.
That really is interesting. Coming back to what you said in the beginning about that, actually, it's the characters taking you through kind of like a journey of your unconsciousness and like thoughts coming out of there. I would be interested because the characters are so different and we have this very wide range of characters and also going through journeys throughout the book. Is there a particular character who you found most interesting as it came to you throughout the process of writing the book?
Well, I mean, you know, the writer creates all the characters. There's this funny way in which when people read, they think like that the narrator is actually the author, but the author is all the characters in the book. I don't know. I mean, I feel the closest to Bruno because I also think of him as the heart of the book. And I wouldn't want to feel close to Sadie. I think, you know, as it, like facing myself, what would that mean? And also, I kept investing her with characteristics that were the exact opposite of my own. You know, like she has this boyfriend who she is not in love with. She's manipulated a relationship out of him. She introduces herself to him by cold bump, as she calls it, which means she just goes up to him in a bar. And she needs the relationship because she can get close to the activists through him because he's childhood best friends with the leader, Pascal. And they're on a TGV train together going to Marseille, and he gets quite nauseous riding backwards. And she's just looking at him like he's an insect, and she has no feeling for what he's suffering. And she thinks it's like a moral weakness to get nauseous riding backwards. I'm like, I can't ride backwards. So there are many ways in which Sadie is the most opposite of me. Bruno, I would say, is the closest. I can feel his heart. And also he is a gentle person. And I wouldn't say I'm a gentle person, but I admire gentleness in people. And I've been around people who seem to dignify the space around them, and they bring out the best in other people and make other people kind of scale back their own aggressive tendencies. And I think that is really, really interesting. And if we ever are to have like social formations that make us less atomized, we will be relying on people like that who have that magic quality. Maybe my favorite character is a minor character named Nadia Duran, she's been expelled by the group. She's loud and opinionated, and she's also middle-aged. And so her analysis is that Pascal has no use for her because she's not young and beautiful, and also she wants to take up space and share her opinions. She is a veteran of, ecological activism, and they take a vote and expel her from. She's not the first person ever to be expelled from a leftist movement, and she won't leave the area and decides to just stay, and she's squatting in this like abandoned sort of rotting manor house and driving the roads and yelling at Pascal every time she sees him, and she's sort of able to say kind of true things from that position of not wanting to charm the leader and find her position in the group. She's already been expelled, and so she doesn't have anything to lose. And at a certain point, she approaches the narrator, Sadie, and kind of seems onto her, like probably knows that she's a cop. And she says, like, listen, you think that you're doing just fine to sidle up to the men at Le Moulin, but you need to pay attention to the women because, they're onto you, basically. And I don't know, yeah, the way that her anger comes out is like kind of interesting to me. And just as a sort of figure who skirts the edges. I also I have a character based on Michel Houellebecq. He just makes a cameo. And, it's Michel Thomas, which is his that's Houellebecq's birth name. Some people might know that. And I sort of figured it's France, and he's the most famous living author in France. And he's known, as Sadie puts it, even by people who don't read books. Like, you can go to any gas station in the most remote region of France, and they will have a Houellebecq novel. My husband exclusively reads Houellebecq novels that he buys in grocery stores. And also, I read Serotonin came out while I was trying to write this book, and it features a pitched battle between dairy farmers and activists on one side and police on the other. And I was trying to construct a novel that would feature an essential scene of dairy farmers and activists in pitched battle with police. And I thought, oh, Houellebecq, beat me to it. And I was complaining to a friend about that, and he said, just put him in your book. So I figured he would kind of be researching Serotonin, even though Houellebecq in real life wouldn't need to research that book because he was trained as an agronomist before he became a novelist. But I like a cameo. It's fun to have a cameo in a novel. So, yeah, that's another. Sadie describes him as having the sexual energy of a grandmother with bone density issues.
That's so interesting because you mentioned that Nadia actually speaks the truth about what's going on in the commune, because what made me really think in the book is the fact that there is this really tension around the access to truth. You also talked about literature as the least useful form of truth. I don't know if you've said that just to me because I'm an activist to make me happy that we have the more useful forms of truth, which I wouldn't agree with.
I was sort of just trying to be polite. I think you can find the truth mostly in fiction.
I would agree with that as well. I think ambiguity would be helpful. I think we would be a lot further down the road if we would allow for more room of ambiguity and actually exploring these, that there are tensions, that there is not one universal truth.
I agree with you about that. Yeah.
And at the same time, I think the book makes a really compelling case for people to explore the reality of ecological destruction and whilst the process of the change, there is no universal truth, there is, I think, quite a lot of very clear things which cases Bruno, for example, makes in saying that what is going on, this is not how humanity can survive, and there is some grain of it which you can extract from the novel. And what I would be interested in is, because I found this tension so fascinating, because there's also so many made up things within the book. We don't really know what Sadie is onto. We don't know how the whole plot would have evolved without her stepping in the commune and making them do things they probably wouldn't have done without her being there. So is that also, do you want the people actually take that away as something from the book, that there is more than one truth in things and that we can bring together all these different perspectives on things and on the happenings in the world right now?
Well, I don't write with the intention to make arguments. I'm sorry I just have to, be honest, and that's, there isn't like an intention behind or a message that I want to emit through my literature. If there was, I would just emit the message. It would be so much more efficient,
I think there's, like, we've seen that also, things which are very upfront and honest with the people are not always efficient. Like, we have been blurting out that the ecological crisis is there and it's still there and nobody's taking action, so maybe there are more efficient ways, even if there are more.
Well, I mean, novels can take you on an experience, and as an art form, I think that it really excels at giving a sense of what it's like to be inside someone else's mind. And I think it's the art form that actually does that best. Other art forms do other things, but that is what the novel does.
I think the book takes us really into the minds of different people. Was there like an initial, like, we have Sadie, we have Bruno, we have Pascal, all with very different motives, and we are also, through the email conversation, if you have read the book or if you're reading it, you will see you really get a lot of the thoughts of Bruno really close to your heart. So it's different than sometimes when you have only one person narrating the book, because there's this huge email exchange, and it brings together all these different threads, I think, of different perspectives on the same situation. So I would love to know, before we come to an end, if there was an initial spark where you said, oh, I will explore this topic of like agriculture in France, of all these comings together. What made you write about this explicit setting, which is, not the most obvious one?
It's a perfect segue to what we're going to end with, the final section. So I had this image of Bruno as a man who presses his ear to the rock wall of his cave and hears what he thinks are like radio transmissions, but they're the voices of people who lived in earlier eras and epics. I wanted to, it felt real to me in a way that I wasn't going to ridicule it or make it seem cartoonish. Like, I believed him that he believes that he really does hear those voices.
Sei jetzt seit 12 Jahren in diesen Höhlen, schrieb und immer noch an kein definierbares Ende gelangt. Vielmehr stelle die Anlage der Höhlen das Konzept eines Endes in Frage. Ich höre Menschen, schrieb deren Stimmen in dieser unterirdischen Welt ewig sind, einer Welt, in der alle Zeitebenen auf einer einzigen Ebene existieren. Hier auf Erden gibt es eine weitere Erde, schrieb eine andere Realität, nicht weniger real, sie hat andere Regeln. Allein durch meine Erklärungen werdet ihr das nicht verstehen, schrieb Bruno. Vielleicht werdet ihr sogar abwinken. Für das wenige, was ich selbst verstehe, war Geduld nötig und rigorose Deprogrammierung. 9/10 ihrer Zeit auf der Erde haben Menschen unterirdisch verbracht. Ihre symbolische Welt entstand zum Teil aus ihren Aktivitäten in Höhlen, von der Dunkelheit verheißenen Modalitäten und Visionen. Dann endete das alles. Die unterirdische Welt ging uns verloren. Die industriellen Nutzungen der Erde, das Graben, das Fracking und das Untertunneln sind bloßer Raub und zählen nicht, schrieb Bruno. Moderne Menschen, die Luftschutzbunker bauen, um diese oder jene Art Apokalypse zu überleben, zählen auch nicht. Ja, sie gehen unter die Erde, aber nicht im Geist eines menschheitsgeschichtlichen Kontinuums, einer Gemeinschaft. Sie denken, ich werde cleverer sein als die anderen und das Massensterben überleben. Aber warum sollte man das Massensterben überleben wollen? Was wäre der Sinn des Lebens, wenn das Leben auf eine Handvoll bewaffneter Pessimisten reduziert wäre, die Konservendosen horten und einander fürchten? In einem Bunker kann man die unterirdische menschliche Gemeinschaft, die tiefe Zisterne der Stimmen, den See unserer Schöpfung, nicht hören. In meiner Höhle, schrieb Unter meiner Höhle höre ich so vieles, was aus tieferen Gängen heraufsteigt, nicht nur das Tropfen von Wasser. Ich höre Stimmen, Menschen, die sprechen, manchmal Französisch, manchmal Okzitanisch oder auch ältere Sprachen des Languedoc. Viele davon erkenne ich gar nicht. Es sind Laute, von denen ich kein Wort verstehe, aber ich weiß, dass das, was ich höre, Menschen sind. Es ist menschliches Sprechen. Hatten wir immer schon Sprache? Die Antwort darauf kennen wir nicht. Linguisten versuchen grafisch zu erfassen, was sie Glottochronologie nennen. Sie stellen sich Sprache wie einen Baum vor, mit einem Stamm und die erste Sprache am Fuß des Stammes, von manchen nostratisch genannt, als schlicht und einfach. Das ist eine Fantasievorstellung. Aber wer könnte diese Linguisten widerlegen? Sie sind nicht imstande, sich aus den Ketten ihres Telos zu befreien, des traurigen Gedankens, sie seien das logische Endergebnis, besäßen die fortgeschrittenste Form menschlicher Sprache und was vor ihnen kam, müsse simpel und grob gewesen sein. Sie übersehen, dass sie, wenn Sprache ein Baum ist, nicht auf den Stamm schauen müssen, sondern auf die Wurzeln, die wie die Wurzeln eines Baumes womöglich einem umgedrehten Kronleuchter von verschwenderischer Komplexität gleichen, der sich bis tief ins dunkle Jenseits hinein verzweigt. Die meisten Menschen sind unfähig zu begreifen, wie tief die physische Welt reicht, und sie können nicht wissen, dass dort unten Stimmen gespeichert sind, es sei denn, sie würden sie selbst hören. Es ist schwer zu erklären, schrieb er. Man müsste gelebt haben, wie ich gelebt habe, getan, was ich getan habe, gelernt, was ich gelernt habe, um zu hören, was ich höre. Man bräuchte ein anderes Bewusstsein. Wenn man unter der Erde lebt, entdeckt man neben anderem, dass man nicht allein ist. Man ist in einer reich bevölkerten Welt, bewohnt von Legionen. Der Homo erectus, der aufstand und kochte, schrieb Bruno, er ist hier. Der Homo neanderthalensis, der bescheiden dahockte und ausufernd träumte, hier. Der Homo sapiens, der in Höhlen ging, um zu mahlen, seine Beute mit zusätzlichen Beinen, zusätzlichen Hörnern ausstattete, sodass diese Tiere schräg über die Höhlenwände rannten oder mit den Köpfen zusammenstießen, aufeinanderprallten und kämpften, alles im Licht einer Fackel. Das unterirdische Kino des H. Sapiens, dieser einfallsreiche und ruinöse Vorfahre von uns, er ist hier. Katharer und andere Heretiker, die wenigen nicht abgeschlachteten, die in die Tiefe gingen und im Dunkeln lebten, ja, anwesend. Kagos, die sich nach dem Krieg von 1594 versteckten, um zu überleben, heimlich zu überleben. Hier, Höhlenkletterer, Männer und Jungen, aus dem 19. Jahrhundert, aus Neugier ums Leben gekommen, abgestürzt, unfähig wieder herauszufinden. Hier, die Partisanen, Männer meiner Kindheit, die sich unter die Erde zurückzogen, um sich vor den randalierenden Deutschen zu verstecken, auch sie sind hier. Lange Zeit, schrieb er, kann man sich nicht einschalten, dann spürt man vielleicht ein Strömen oder Surren tellurischer Energie. Dieses Geräusch wandelt sich, je mehr Zeit man in den Höhlen verbringt. Es wird zu Stimmen. Man hört diese Stimmen, ohne sie isolieren zu können. Man braucht Jahre, um das genaue Zuhören zu lernen, Geräusche auseinanderzuhalten, seinen inneren Tuner auf die zeitlose Bandbreite der unterirdischen Welt auszurichten. »Erinnert ihr euch noch an Kurzwellensender?« fragte er sie. »Wahrscheinlich nicht«, antwortete er selber. Sich in Kurzwellenprogramme einzuschalten, war mal eine Kunst. Je nach Bandbreite funktionierte es am besten nachts, was etwas damit zu tun hatte, wie Radiowellen aus der Ionosphäre reflektiert werden. Es gab da ein Buch, schrieb er, das die Programme nach Terminplan und Megahertz aufführte. Manche der Programme bekam man stärker herein als andere. Man lernte darauf zu hören, wohin man den Kurzwellenregler zwischen 2 Punkten atmosphärischer Störungen drehen und wie man seine Antenne ausrichten musste, um einen bulgarischen Chor zu hören oder Nachrichten aus dem Senegal oder das venezolanische Radio Juventud. Die Kurzwelle ist natürlich real, aber sie ist auch eine Metapher. Ich spreche nicht davon, um in Erinnerungen über tote Technologien zu schwelgen, sondern um euch verstehen zu helfen. Höhlenfrequenzen betragen nicht 3 bis 30 Megahertz. Die Höhlenbandbreite überspannt Augenblicke, Zeitalter, Epochen, Äonen. Man muss lernen, sich in die Monophonie einzuhören, sie zu entflechten. Am Ende eröffnet sich einem die außerordentlichste Polyphonie. Man beginnt zu sortieren, zu filtern. Man hört Geflüster, Gelächter, Gemurmel, Bitten. Es entsteht das Gefühl, dass alle hier sind. Ein wundervolles Gefühl, sollte ich hinzufügen. Denn plötzlich wird einem klar, wie allein wir gewesen sind, wie isoliert, wie gefangen, in der Kalenderzeit feststeckend und abgeschnitten von allen, die vor uns kamen. Ich möchte nie wieder so allein sein, schrieb er.
Ja, was ein Ende. What an ending. What words to end on this amazing reading. I want to give some thanks at first to Marc Oliver for reading the German parts of the book. Also a round of applause for the people who made all the technical possibilities here, who did the live stream, who made this event possible here. Then obviously for the literature and the team at Rowohlt, thank you for organizing the event. And obviously the greatest round of applause for Rachel for the book. We will come for the logistical details in the end.
Thanks, Carla. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
There will be a table with books outside, both in English and in German. And Rachel, I have heard you will be available to sign some of the copies, so be
yes,
there.
Happy to. But buy the German edition, since the Revolt people are here.
Thank you very much.